Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. The cafe was bustling. A low-key waterfront restaurant. The expansive view of Puget Sound did all the talking. A subtle poshness that just doesn't have to try too hard. No dress code beyond the Pacific Northwest staple. Understated, comfortable, sturdy. The food, equally no nonsense, but expensive. In the way that high-quality fresh seafood always is. Award-winning chowder, crab cakes, but the woman at the bar, she wasn't interested in what was on the menu. She was intrigued by the man sitting at a nearby table with a group of friends. He wasn't saying much. A small chuckle here, a nod of encouragement there. But the spark of intelligence in his eyes, she knew it could have burned the place down if he'd wanted to. There were his subtle mannerisms. Clearly the alpha, the leader of his pack of friends. Compared to him, they were a rowdy bunch of pups, each yearning and vying for his attention. Because they all quieted when he spoke. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but instead watched his body language. Graceful, determined, confident. He was sitting down, so she guessed he was about 5'10"-ish, slim, athletic build, but his face was interesting. Young-ish, but weathered. He clearly enjoyed the outdoors. His hands looked soft, but not weak, artistic, yet sturdy. But it was his liquid brown eyes that she kept coming back to. From them, she guessed he was in his late 20s. The wrinkles around the edges, an indication he'd shared a lot of laughs in his life. At least that's what she was thinking when he met her gaze. Suddenly, she was caught. And yet, she didn't look away, but locked eyes. And soon, he was walking over toward her, as she knew he would all along. He'd been watching her too. He introduced himself as Scott Scurlock. That was expected. But what took her by surprise was what he did next. He whispered in her ear, "I'd like to take you to somewhere special, somewhere you've never seen before. My treehouse." Of course she would go.
I mean, I know a couple different people that went home with him, and he went to his treehouse, and they said, yeah, we took a shower outside. It was really cool, and, there's a bathtub outside, and just kind of, it was more, if they were like, love the one you're with, they were like one-night stands type of thing. They weren't in a relationship with Scott.
Yeah. So did they say that they were happy with how it went? I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 177, part 2 of Hollywood, Robin Hood and his merry band of brothers.
One of the favorite restaurants Scott liked to go to is called El Sarape, a Mexican restaurant, and I understand he went to the manager and gave the manager several $1,000s and said to the manager, I would like you to distribute this to your female wait staff, those that are single and single moms, anonymously. Beyond the big tips, he did some of that stuff.
If you haven't already, please go back and listen to last week's episode, part 1 of Hollywood. But first, a quick recap. So Scott Scurlock grew up in Virginia, moved to Hawaii when he was just 19, and lived a chill life until he decided to get serious.
He was searching. He was young. He was searching, but he wanted something more out of life. And I thought he would find something. He had a determination about him.
At 23, Scott Scurlock moved to Olympia, Washington, a place that suited his tastes.
Olympia has got like I would say a hippie vibe still. We have 3 colleges here, a community college, a Catholic college, and the Evergreen State College, which is considered pretty avant-garde.
Scott had always dreamed of becoming a doctor. He'd put those plans on hold after moving to Hawaii. But life has a way of getting us back on track, which is exactly what happened after Scott and his friend were kicked off the banana farm when their landlord discovered they were illegally growing marijuana.
They robbed some marijuana plants. They found it on one of their hikes, and they then started a grow operation. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't anything crazy, but on that banana place.
Yeah, God, it was a long time ago, but it does seem like I can remember them being really bummed about they had done that, and they were really excited. They were going to grow their own pot and not have to buy it anymore. And then they got caught and kicked out of their paradise.
Getting kicked out of their paradise was a wake-up call. And in 1978, Scott packed up and left island life behind him. But he brought his mindset with him to Olympia, roughly an hour away from Seattle. Olympia is a place where Scott's signature low-top Converse sneakers would always be in style.
Lots of artists live here. Lots of unusual, folks who are world travelers. This is kind of a base for them. We're right on, the Puget Sound, and so we have people come in who have. I remember just anecdotally who have traveled the world. I remember one time I went to a restaurant in downtown Olympia with a friend of mine who was a jazz pianist and his wife, and we sat with another couple, and they had just literally pulled in to the dock from traveling around the world on their sailboat. A lot of very interesting folks here, very art, music, big time. And it's the state capital, so you have economic stability, most pretty good wages, and it spills over. But it's a relatively small town. There are like 3 cities that are, there's Olympia, then Lacey, and Tumwater. But Olympia has got its very tolerant, I would say.
Very what?
Tolerant.
Oh, tolerant, right.
That's Sean. He's an attorney, and we'll get to how he came to know Scott later in the show. But for now, you should know that when Scott moved to Olympia in the late 1970s, he enrolled at Evergreen State College as a pre-med student specializing in organic and biochemistry. He was 23 years old. Another thing that you should know is Evergreen State College, it's not like any other college you've probably heard of. The campus is surrounded by 1,000 acres of dense Pacific Northwest wilderness that ultimately thins out at the southern end of Puget Sound, and there's a small trail that leads to a geoduck beach. Now, a geoduck is native to the Pacific Northwest, and it is the world's largest burrowing clam. It's a species of saltwater clam like no other. It can have upwards of an 8-inch shell, and then stuffed inside is a siphon that also extends out 3 feet. Geoducks can only be dug out at very low tides when the tip of the siphon sticks out of the sand. And when you get close to it, it'll squirt out water if it senses danger. And if you want to go clam digging, it is not an easy dig. It's not like other clams. You've got to go deep, down 2 or 3 feet to find it. Now, I'm going on and on about geoducks, and there's a reason for it. In 1971, the college founders chose the geoduck as the Evergreen State College's mascot. So this mascot that they call Speedy is a geoduck that was chosen as the school's mascot because the founders felt that it was a representation of a non-aggressive and innovative alternative to traditional in-your-face kind of sports mascots. And that the geoduck symbolized the school's core values of digging deep and just letting it all hang out. And they weren't kidding when they said letting it all hang out. If you've never seen a geoduck clam letting it all hang out, please go look it up now. But I'll give you a hint. I'm not the first one to say it's very phallic looking, especially when paired with the school's non-traditional fight song. If you didn't catch the lyrics, they are, quote, "Go, geoducks, go, Through the mud and the sand, let's go, siphon high, squirt it out, swivel all about, let it all hang out. Evergreen State College, that's where Scott Scurlock enrolled in 1978. He also rented a little Cape Cod-style house near the college, which sat on 19 acres of land, which included a beautiful grove of old-growth cedar trees.
How far away was his property to the state capitol?
Well, probably less than 3 miles, maybe 2-3 miles. I mean, I live closer to where Scott lived, but he was near Evergreen State College, kind of across the way, but it's 3 miles maybe.
The challenge for Scott was that he had high hopes of becoming a doctor, which meant a lot of schooling. But there was the other side of him that loved to travel, enjoyed the company of his friends and women, good food and drink.
I'd see him at local restaurants, and very friendly guy, and so my vibe was that of kind of a cool guy.
As a student at Evergreen State College, Scott is intelligent, he's concerned for the environment, he's a young man who had always dreamed of becoming a doctor to help find a cure for cancer. He was taking pre-med classes, which of course included chemistry. Now, here's where Scotty made a left turn, when he could have just continued going right. It's here that he realized he had an opportunity to make some money. Using the school's chemistry lab, without anyone knowing it, he began to allegedly cook crystal meth at the college. Not only did he utilize the school's labs during off hours, but according to the lore, he also used some of their supplies to cook this meth. Here's Warren, who was Scott Scurlock's boss back in Hawaii and also his roommate.
So it sounds like he ramped up to meth and he was actually doing it at the college that he went to.
But I'd heard a rumor or two about that. But
what did you hear?
That he was making money off from meth and that they were out in the woods and trailers and things. But by then, Scott and I were no longer in communication. It was just maybe somebody from his old banana patch days that I happened to meet at a bar one night or something.
It's interesting, even after all these years, when I reached out to Evergreen for an interview about Scott Scurlock's alleged activities at the school, they would only confirm that he was a student there.
And I guess the sketchiness is, I was in-house counsel at Evergreen. I was pretty familiar with the culture out there, and a lot of it was live and let live. And, there was certainly a high tolerance for drug use back in the day, marijuana certainly. And I was not into that at all. But I suspected that if you were an Evergreen student, you probably, partied hard and you did whatever it was back in the day.
Scott's little Cape Cod-style house was on 19 acres. It was close to the college, but with all that land, it was very private. And there was also this really huge barn on the property. The perfect place for Scott to build an underground meth network, which allowed him to pay for his extensive travel, his school, when he attended, and continue his lifestyle as a carefree bachelor.
A lot of people said he looked like a young, I forget the actor's
Mel
name.
Gibson?
Mel Gibson, yeah, that's right. And he was a very nice guy. He's the kind of guy that Olympia and Western Washington kind of attracts. Mysterious background. I assumed he was like a trust baby because some of the people he hung around with were their parents were very wealthy people, so I assumed he was some trust kid that was going to Evergreen. But I personally, I know this may upset people, but I found him to be a very nice guy.
Scott made the drugs and sold them to a dealer, and it wasn't long before the money started rolling in. Even so, Scott was smart enough to keep a low profile. He drove an old pickup truck.
But as for his dress, he dressed like almost everybody else in Olympia. We're pretty, multi-layered, and I don't think anybody really dresses to impress. At least I don't, and I don't think Scott did.
But he loved to travel. But he also got a reputation as potentially being a trust fund baby.
Dr. Paul Puri. I'm a psychiatrist and writer and a handful of other things.
I reached out to Paul after I came across a piece he'd written featuring his loose psychoanalysis of some of our favorite fictitious Hollywood cast of anti-heroes.
I'll talk from a couple different hats as we go into this, if that's okay. I have,
of course, yeah.
Just as a little bit of context, in addition to being like a psychiatrist and professor and all that stuff, I'm also a TV writer. So I have sort of a different lens on this in addition. So like, if you go into like a 4-quadrant kind of thing, there's classic heroes, which are like the perfect good guys. There's classic villains. And then you have anti-heroes, which are sort of people that are very flawed and maybe, even negative in some ways, but still are the protagonists. Then you have anti-villains, which are much more common now, which are sort of the antagonists in stories, but we can understand their motivations. We can identify with them in some ways.
Paul will help us throughout this series try to unpack Scott Scurlock from an armchair quarterback lens, because although he's a psychiatrist, he never actually treated Scott Scurlock.
And I have to give a little bit, Caroline, of like a disclaimer. So psychiatrists are not supposed to like diagnose public figures. The article you read was like me diagnosing fictional characters, which is sort of, we have this thing within the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, called the Goldwater Rule. And the reason is like, if you've never examined a person, you can only like, you start to insert your own bias a bit. That's always a risk. And so with Barry Goldwater back in the day, like they basically surveyed they sent out like a mailer to a bunch of psychiatrists to say like, what do you think is wrong with Barry Goldwater? And they got all of this like range of stuff, like he's a psychopath, he's schizophrenic, he's whatever. And so some people believe that actually like scuttled his presidential nomination. And so we're like, is this our role? And it became sort of an ethical rule for psychiatrists to not weigh in on it. That's now been challenged with our more recent political situations, and maybe we should revise that. But I just want to put that out there that like I am caveating my interpretation of Scott, recognizing I've never obviously examined him and I can only guess for things, but I just have to put that out there first.
Okay, so now that we have that disclaimer out of the way, I want to dive into Paul's thoughts about Scott's growing love of Hollywood rebels. He had all these movie fantasies, which could have fueled the very practical reality of most college students who need to make money. But most college students also don't make the choice to co-opt their chemistry labs at their college to make meth.
I can try to like reverse engineer to what I know about like human behavior and human psychology. So like with many people, and Hollywood is notorious for this. That's what makes the stories they tell very attractive, is they are hyping up, they're creating an intensified or hyperbolic sort of fantasy of a situation. And so the idea that can be very attractive to people is like, God, why can't I do that? Why can't I fly? Why can't I rob banks? What if I were to become a drug? So it becomes like, oh my God, how can I play this out in the most salacious, interesting way possible? Because that's going to be the most fun for the viewer. But for somebody who, from the little bit of bio that I know about Scott, he already had a little bit of what we commonly call sort of antisocial tendencies. Like he was making meth in his chemistry lab. Like he already was sort of veering away from like being a rule follower. So he maybe was, we could label that as sort of counterculture. But there was already a part of him that was like dabbling with the idea of like, what can I do outside the lines and get away with it? And then someone plays out, here's this really cool fantasy thing to do. And it becomes something that he can grab onto. And then maybe he just like bakes on the idea for a while until he says, you know what, I'm going to go do this.
And conversely, why is it that we sometimes root for these characters? I mean, you heard my introduction. Clearly, I'm rooting for this anti-hero. And honestly, I don't know why. I guess maybe I do. I do know why.
Anti-heroes appeal because they're really closer to who all of us are. We all are conflicted beings. We all have sides of us that are fighting. even though we maybe participate in a civil society and do what we're supposed to do, there's part of us that wants to just rebel and do the other thing, and and wants to, like, I don't even know, in this case, maybe people have a fleeting thought about robbing that bank, that fantasy that pops in their head, and they say, like, what would happen if that goes through? And so it makes sense to them to actually see that played out. They can identify with the person who does it to some extent, because that's their fantasy being carried out.
Scott's drug empire not only paid for his school and his lifestyle, but in the early 1980s, it paid for his passion. He wanted to build his version of a masterpiece. A 3-story treehouse. At the back of his property, Scott picked out a spot in the center of 7 old-growth cedar trees, which had a view of the majestic Mount Rainier in the background. Scott began building his treehouse. And he invited his most trusted friend group to help him, not only with his drug business, but also to help him build what would become his treehouse, which eventually had 30 windows, electricity, plumbing, a full kitchen, a bathroom, and a fireplace. The 3-story treehouse was around 1,500 square feet and had this appearance of being secretly stashed within this grove of trees, as if it were being hugged for safekeeping within the sturdy network of these evergreen branches. And the windows were framed out with honey-colored trimmings. The siding, so very Pacific Northwest, was cedar shake. On the sun deck, there was a shower and a toilet, and inside, there were impressive 6-foot picture windows and, of course, fire poles for quick descents. There was this intersecting walkway way up high in the trees. Scott called it his stairway to heaven, but the treehouse itself, he christened the 7 Cedars.
It was behind the house, quite a distance, I would have to say old growth. There was a stairwell that went around the main tree, kind of like a Dr. Seuss thing. No handrail, and as you said, it rains 11 months out of the year. I remember going up there. The steps were super slick, no handrail, so you're like hugging the tree. If you're not a tree hugger,
you're in the wrong place.
Yeah. So you got to the first floor, if I remember correctly, and it was kind of like the entryway, and as I said, there were TVs there, couches and stuff. And then the second floor, basically a bed. And then the third floor, I think, was some sort of observatory thing or something like that. Now, remember, this is like 60 feet off the ground. And then there's a bathroom, which you walk the plank over to another tree area. And there is a toilet and a mirror and a sink with the pipes going down, again, like a Dr. Seuss thing. And I remember going out there, and it's like, oh my God. And then you're worried because you get a little, self-conscious. You're sitting there, in all God's glory. No one's around there. I mean, unless there's a helicopter. So it was, and I understood he and his father and his roommates tried to put a hot tub up there, and it was so heavy there was no way in hell, and that collapsed. And that's why the county was concerned, because there were no codes. Whatever he could do, he did. And then there was this fire pole that I mentioned that was kind of adjacent to the stairs, that if you needed to get out in a hurry, you could slide down the pole.
When you walked to the bathroom, was the bathroom outside?
Yeah.
Was there any covering over it?
No. Other than the tree.
Was there railings to get to the bathroom?
I don't remember that.
It's like, as you're talking it, like, I think when you see it and you hear the story, it's so romanticized, and you're just like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. Oh my God. At least I was, it just really drew me, just the treehouse lair alone. Yeah. But it sounds so precarious and dangerous, especially if you're drinking. And I've heard that they did drugs. Like, it literally is like, and if you fall, like, you're gone.
Yeah, that's one thing. It's funny you mention that, because I remember, I think it was on the first floor, they had quite a few bottles of super expensive cognac, that kind of in like the round, looks like a tire type of thing.
Yeah.
You know, he had a number of those bottles. So you're right. Yeah, if you're drunk or high and you have to use the bathroom, good luck to you. I'm not sure. You know, maybe I don't know. I was scared, and
And you were
I
sober.
was straight. I was sober, and I go, I'm scared to be out here. You know.
Now, Sean, the attorney, met Scott because at some point the county tried to make him tear down his treehouse.
Scott was referred to me primarily because he was concerned that the county, Thurston County, where he lived, wanted to tear down his treehouse. Someone referred him to me, and whoever that did actually also indicated what the solution would be, which was simply that the county had no ordinances governing tree houses like other counties in the state of Washington, and therefore had no jurisdiction, and they went away. So Scott was happy with that. And then I ended up representing him on some other minor, mischief type stuff, but nothing major.
After the issue with the treehouse was resolved, Scott would ask Sean for his blessing on another matter.
After we first met in my office downtown, he asked about going out with my receptionist, and I said, you can ask her. It's up to you what you want to do. And they did go out, I think, once, but I think she had a exit via there was a fire pole at the treehouse, and so she had to get out in a hurry, apparently. Did not go back.
Scott knew how to draw people in. He was a big spender, but low-key. Only his tightest circle of friends knew he was secretly selling loads of drugs. And these trusted friends, what he would refer to as his merry band of brothers, of course, making himself Robin Hood, well, they came to stay with him, especially if they were down on their luck. He would lavish them with his attention, ply them with alcohol, and they helped him build his treehouse, which included stealing wood from nearby lumber mills. There was just something Scott found irresistible about getting over on people. He didn't need to steal the wood. He had plenty of money, and yet he couldn't help himself. Together with his friends, Scott created a secret world that he cultivated as the leader on his 19-acre property. Additionally, on his property, Scott created an off-the-grid banking system. Basically, he buried his drug money there. He bundled up cash from his meth operation into white plastic buckets and also drugs for safekeeping and future sales. He then covered the tops of these buckets with duct tape and buried them around the acreage. He created a treasure map to remind him of where they were buried. And by the mid-1980s, Scott's mystique, this good-looking, mysterious bachelor who had built this romantic, functional, unique, special treehouse, had grown to the point that in 1986, a reporter from the Seattle Times came out to his treehouse to do a story on the 27-year-old. In this article, Scott insisted that he only wanted to be identified by his first name. And he talked to the reporter about how he'd grown up in Virginia, how he lived and surfed in Hawaii before he moved out to the Northwest. He shared that he studied organic chemistry and biochemistry at Evergreen. And it was during this interview in the treehouse that he set the stage with music playing and served quiche. There was a picture of Scott sitting in a chair inside the treehouse on an Afghan rug. The reporter wrote, quote, "Aware of his image as an Evergreen State Tarzan, Scott wore a mask of rare bird feathers and a loincloth to a Halloween party last year," end quote. What's interesting about this article is that it's a foreshadowing of the duality of Scott's nature. He wanted to showcase his masterpiece, risking unwanted attention and questions. After all, his secret life selling illicit drugs actually was what was fueling the construction of his treehouse and his entire lifestyle. While at the same time, Scott kept a low profile when it came to the way he dressed and the old truck he drove. But his reputation of being a big spender continued to grow.
Well, the very first time that I met Scott was at a restaurant, Carnegie, and I was a cocktailer there, and he used to come in with his cronies, and I saw him more when I moved over to Bud Bay Cafe, and I was a bartender and also a server. He would come in frequently. We ordered special champagne for Scott. He only wanted like the Clicquot de Grande Dame or Cristal or Dom Perignon, or his tastes were very expensive. And it wasn't really what we were selling in Olympia, but we always had it on hand for him because when he came in, we knew we were going to make a good sale.
That's Pam Oates.
My name is Pam Oates, and I am a partner general manager at Bud Bay Cafe.
Okay, great. And that's in Olympia?
It's in Olympia.
Okay.
We've been there since 1988. 88 we opened.
Wow. That's really great. I mean, that's in the restaurant biz, that's quite a feat, especially these days, right? With the pandemic and everything.
Right. Yeah. Well, our sister restaurant that we own too is actually the oldest restaurant in Washington State.
Really? What's that one called?
The Oyster House.
When it came to food and drink, Scott had expensive tastes. But even though he enjoyed the finer things in life, he never became soft. Being in peak physical condition was always extremely important to Scott. In fact, on his refrigerator door was a piece of paper, and he'd copied down the line from the movie Pale Rider, which came out in 1985, a Western where Clint Eastwood played a mysterious stranger known only as the Preacher, who came to help a small town of gold miners fight a corrupt marshal. The line Scott had on his refrigerator that he read every morning said, quote, "Well, that spirit ain't spit without a little exercise." So this movie ends with a deadly shootout between the Preacher and the bad guy's posse. It's funny in this story how life often imitates art. But let's get back to the bar and Pam, because she recalled serving Scott and his merry band of brothers many times over the years.
It was super easy to wait on, very friendly. He was always coming back from some trip, some excursion, or so, he'd talk to me about where he'd been and his travels, and we always got his champagne. Sometimes he'd want you to open it, but most of the time he just wants you to put it on the table. So he would actually do all the work, and then he'd slip you a crisp $100 bill every time. So everybody wanted to wait on Scott and his friends because he was so generous.
Scott also used his cash to groom his friends. He helped them in their time of need because it was complicated. He needed their help building his treehouse. He also had other construction projects around the house. And they watched his place when he went on these extravagant trips, and he included them in his drug operation because he needed people around him that he could trust. And he made it easy for them to trust him too. Not to mention, his resources made their lives easier.
So he wasn't like this big strapping hunk, like he didn't walk in and you go, wow. But he had really nice facial structure. He did a lot of like yoga and things like that. So his body was kind of lithe and chiseled. And he had a nice smile. He was definitely attractive, but he wasn't to me, like the most handsome man I've ever seen. But he had it going on. He had a nice smile. He was very affable, easygoing, very easy to talk to, made you feel special. He had that kind of quality to him.
This ability to make a person feel special. One can imagine that he'd grown up watching his father do it thousands of times during those sermons. But there was a dark side of Scott that few people saw. Pam recalled witnessing his shadow side just once, but it was very memorable.
So when I was in college, I waited tables. I worked at Salty's at Redondo. So I'm totally kind of getting the vibe of what the type of restaurant that it was. And just like we had a customer there that was the same kind of way where he would always tip $100. And I was like trying to figure out the timeline. Like, gosh, would this be the same guy? I mean, did he somehow make his way down, south or north? And but there was that quality where we'd like fight to wait on the table because you're just hoping. Yeah. So like when he did he, because he had expensive taste, was he down to earth or was he an asshole or like what?
He was very, he was not an asshole. He did get into one fight, the only fight I know of, like a physical fight. At the Bay, he was, Scott's politics were very liberal. And, we're the state capital, so we have a lot of legislative types of people. And, you just, as a bartender, you just don't talk about religion, or you don't talk about politics. You just, to keep things calm. But Scott got in an argument with a very right-wing person, and they started hitting each other. They got in fisticuffs. And then the bartender at the time, leapt over the bar and broke them up. That's the only time I've ever heard of anything of Scott being, violent in any way.
But it was easy to push incidents like that away because Scotty was more than just a big tipper. He was seen as generous with his friends and the people he met that he wanted to help.
It's my understanding one of the favorite restaurants Scott liked to go to was called El Sarape, a Mexican restaurant, and I understand he went to the manager and gave the manager several $1,000s and said to the manager, "I would like you to distribute this to your female wait staff, those that are single and single moms, anonymously." Beyond the big tips, he did some of that stuff.
Sean, remember Scott's attorney, says he too was drawn into his charm, even though he had heard rumors about his drug connections.
He's like a lot of the folks you find in the Olympia area that have we're like the corner of a farmer's field. Somebody said once that all the odd stuff is over here, but I knew he was involved in some sketchy stuff. Just that, based on some of the folks that were in his group, and I some drug stuff, which was in my bag, and I wanted to maintain a professional distance.
And when it came to being a bona fide ladies' man, Pam says as a bartender, a lot of women didn't care what he did, so long as they could have an adventure with him at his infamous treehouse.
They told me all about the treehouse because he liked to have his little love sessions there. Yeah.
So I don't want you to feel like you have to kiss and tell, but I know you didn't it sounds like you didn't do the kissing, but what would they say? Just because they're going to be anonymous, what would they say about?
Well, Scott just had a kind of Svengali quality about him. He was charming, and I could see how, the ladies would for him. And yeah, I know a couple different people that went home with him, and he went to his treehouse, and they said, yeah, we took a shower outside. It was really cool, and there's a bathtub outside, and just kind of, it was more if they were like love the one you're with. They were like one night stands type of thing. They weren't in a relationship with Scott.
Yeah. So did they say that they were happy with how it went?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was so long ago. I don't know specifics, but it wasn't.
I know.
There was nothing aggressive about him or anything. It was, hey, it was a fun night, and then I went up to his treehouse. It was really cool, and we hung out, and it was great, and smoked some weed, and but it wasn't do a bunch of heavy drugs or anything. It was just more drinking and smoking pot type of thing.
Pam referred to Scotty as a Svengali, which is a reference to a character in a novel about a man who seduces, controls, and exploits a young girl. Now, as I researched for this show, I'd heard that Scott had taken pictures of his sexual liaisons at the treehouse. Some women apparently knew about the photos, others didn't. And that Scott would show these photos to his friends and even his dad. Now, I've never seen the book and asked the FBI if they could confirm the contents of its existence in their files. But for some reason, even after so many years, they would neither confirm or deny it. But Dr. Paul Puri weighs in on the photos.
Look, misogyny has been rampant in our world forever, and it continues on. And again, Hollywood, especially in the 70s and 80s, really played that up quite a lot, and really continues to. But the nature of sort of objectifying women, of using sort of photos, of playing out the nature of sexual fantasies, women as objects, all of these things are sort of consistent with that, of let me take photos as a form of control, as a form of fantasy, as a form of how can I show off my conquests. and show it off to other people. So all of that sort of is kind of consistent. It also, potentially is, this is too much, but it potentially is like blackmail kind of material of being like, look at, there's like an ownership kind of thing to another person of being, and this is used now with like, I want to say it's kind of like revenge porn kind of things where people will videotape their partners, and then after a breakup, they'll like send it wide. Which is very exploitative and terrible for the party who's being exposed in that way. It breaks all forms of trust. So, I think that's all consistent with sort of the playboy and the psychopathy component to it.
Scott was making so much money selling drugs. At some point, he called his former boss, Warren, who was also his friend and former roommate, and told him about the treehouse.
Showed me pictures of this treehouse he had, and some people that I knew that knew him had been telling me about this fabulous treehouse he was making, and just that was the focus of his life, was this treehouse and how cool it was.
And he had other questions too about large sums of money.
But he looked me up and he wanted to go back over financial information. He wanted to know about taxes, and he wanted to know how to sort of hide money. I said, well, I really don't. I had an accountant in Manoa, an old lady, and I remember one year there was a discrepancy of a nickel. We spent almost 3 hours trying to figure out where that nickel went to or came from. So I put a nickel on the table and she said, no, that's not the point. We have to figure this out. So I told Scott, I really don't know about how to hide money. I said, one way I know people do it is, they combine their business with remodeling their house or doing personal things. And I said, I think the IRS is really aware of that. And, if you do that in excess, they probably would bother you. I don't know what you're doing that you have all this cash, because he didn't tell me what he was doing. He said he was growing a lot of pot.
After Scotty's adventurous trips, he would always make his way back to the Bud Bay Cafe, order his specialty champagne, and pull out his huge roll of cash and let everyone continue to wonder what he did. Was he a trust fund baby, a building contractor? Of course, the skeptics whispered other things, and Pam, behind the bar, heard it all.
We're always a little curious about him because, when he'd get you his $100 bill, he'd reach into his pocket and he had a wad of $100 bills. So we all, kind of speculated what he did, or, we never saw anything violent about him because he was kind of just a real kind of mellow guy. He wasn't aggressive or anything, and kind of like turn a blind eye, but we thought maybe he was a gambler or maybe a drug dealer or, did something.
Next time on part 3 of Hollywood. For Scotty, everything would change after his drug partner was found murdered, shot in the forehead. That reality was a wake-up call, one that terrified Scott Scurlock to the point where he gave up drug dealing as a means to support himself. After all, he still had those white buckets filled with cash buried around his property. But at some point, the money would run out. However, inspiration was just a click away.
Little Hen says it's time to rock and roll. Everybody freeze! Everybody move! Keep your hands up and your eyes down!
Up next, criminal mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host, Brandon Morgan, and I will go over the case in more detail. Trust me, there's a lot more to talk about that treehouse, so stick around. And as always, thanks for listening. From Pie in the Sky Media, Criminal Mischief is an EVO production, recorded live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. For EVO Creative, I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.